Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies here in the Institute for Social Research. And it is a great pleasure to be here and welcome you and to welcome our speakers, one of whom's coming from out of town. Our first speaker today is Ken Goldstein. He's a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco and faculty director of the University of San Francisco in Washington, D.C. program. He's widely recognized as one of the leading experts on political advertising and elections. He has long been a consultant with ABC News in their election coverage team. He got his PhD from Michigan many years ago, several decades ago, and it's good to have him back. Our second speaker will be Walter Mebane. He's a professor of political science and professor of statistics here at the University of Michigan, and also a faculty associate in the Center for Political Studies. He's well known for, among other things, the development of the field of electoral forensics, which is using statistical methods to test for human manipulation and potential fraud in elections. Our third and final speaker is Vince Hutchings. He's a professor of political science and research professor in the Center for Political Studies here at ISR. He's well known for his research on race and politics, and he was director of the American National Election Studies from 2014 to 2017. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Each speaker will talk for 15 to 20 minutes. I will be a strict chair, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. So, Ken.
Great, thank you very much. And this is the clicker?
I think so.
All right, excellent, great. Thank you very much for having me and for the kind introduction. And it is really super to be back at Michigan, which is really the place that gave me the boost and all the training. It's nice to see a bunch of former students who are University of Michigan in Washingtoners, and I hope they will forgive me if I also say my very favorite University of Michigan student is also in the room, who I happen to be related to. So let me just jump right into a bit of a summary. I think this should maybe be changing, but that is in fact a static image. And let me also be clear that it's not races that I'm calling on behalf of ABC, where we have a very strict rule that you can't call the race if it's under 1 percentage point. And as we've seen over the last week, that's the reason why we have that strict rule, that you cannot call a race if it is 1 percentage point. And I should probably have waited till after Walter went with his election forensics to show what some of these numbers are, because maybe he'll have them changing or should be changing. But the big question on everyone's mind is, was this a wave? Now, of course, who knows what a wave is, and no one defines what a wave is, so it's pretty hard to say it was a wave or not a wave, but it feels wave-ish to me. And I think Democrats were not particularly exuberant on election night. It might just be hard for Democrats to be super happy lately. But I do think that the body language of Democrats is they were happy they'd taken control of the House, but definitely a little disappointment on election night and the next morning because it didn't feel wave-ish. After a week with almost all of those additional House races that were not called that night going towards the Democrats, with the Democrat winning the Arizona Senate race, and with the Florida race in a recount, I would not expect that outcome to change. I do think we're exactly a week away. The Democrats are feeling a little bit happier, gaining in the high 30s in terms of House seats. I'm assuming that the Republicans are going to win that Florida Senate seat, and then but the Democrats winning 7 governorships, which is very important, and also winning north of 300 seats in state legislatures and turning a couple state legislatures across the country, which is very important, especially as we go into a census year, if we do a census, into a census year, and then redistricting after that. A couple other points which I haven't seen people talk about to sort of put it into context a little bit. The Democrats did not have the big numbers that the Republicans got in 2010. But if you look at two-year House changes, it's pretty similar. So one of the reasons why the Republicans got 63 seats, there was a swing of 63 seats in 2010, is because Obama was on the ballot in 2008. The Democrats won a bunch of seats which they had no business winning in 2008. So if you actually add the Obama wins to the Democratic losses, you get a combined 45 seats in 2008 and 2010. The Republicans actually lost some seats in 2016, so if you do a combined 2006, 2018, you get somewhere between, depending on some of these outcomes, 43 or 45. So actually, the 2008-2010 swing is virtually identical to the 2016-2018 swing that we're going to see. If you also look at generic House vote, it was about 5 percentage points on election night, but like what happened in 2016 when it was the national popular vote was tied and it tended to creep up as California finally decides to count its votes over a week and a half. Democrats are going to end up with about a 7 percentage point lead in the popular vote if you add up all the House districts, which is very similar to what the Republicans got +7 in 1994, which is widely considered a wave, whatever a wave is. Or in 2006, Democrats were +8. And in 2010, that number there that gave the Republicans 63 additional seats in the House, Republicans won the national vote by 7 percentage points. Let me sort of just take you through, and some of these slides might look a little bit familiar to someone who took campaigns and elections. So this is just the exit poll, party ID by loyalty, and you see in 2010 even partisanship, because if I learned one thing at Michigan, I learned that Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans vote for Republicans, you see solid party loyalty there, but Republicans winning independents by a massive 16 percentage points. In 2014, also when Republicans did well in midterms, Republicans actually had an advantage in the composition of the electorate. Again, strong party loyalty, and again, Republicans winning independents by 12 percentage points. Pop here to 2016. Much to everybody's surprise, while the Democrats had a 4 percentage point advantage in party ID, Democrats had become addicted to the Obama 7 or 8 percentage point advantage in party ID, which was the case in 2008 and 2012. Democrats only have a 4 percentage point advantage. Republicans were actually a little bit more loyal to Trump than Democrats were to Clinton, and Trump wins independents by 6 percentage points. So what you have here is Democrats certainly did not recreate the Obama electorate, but for Democrats to have a +4 or exactly identical to what the previous presidential election was is actually quite an accomplishment. So Democrats are +4 in terms of party identification. That would have given them, that gave them a pretty good base, but then what puts it over the top and makes it wave-ish is for the first time since Barack Obama won independence in 2008, Democrats won independence in 2018. Now, for all of you graduate students, independents are such a mushy term, right? There's lots going on. Some of those people are closeted partisans who are really Democrats or really Republicans. Some go back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. But there is some signal through the noise of independence there. And one thing that suggests to me that independent number is actually pretty good news for the Democrats is sometimes you'll see a party do better with independents, or do better or worse with independents, but then you'll see them do better or worse with people who are loyal. The fact that Democrats were more loyal, slightly more loyal to their nominees than Republicans were to their nominees, plus that they won independents, suggests to me that it was not simply lots of Democrats sticking in that independent category. One thing that I looked at in 2016 and what really decided the presidential election was that the haters went for Donald Trump. Right? So unshockingly, if you liked Hillary Clinton and you didn't like Donald Trump, you voted for Hillary Clinton. Also, unshockingly, if you liked Donald Trump and didn't like Hillary Clinton, you went for Donald Trump. But a full 20% of the electorate, 18% of the electorate, 1 in 5 voters, didn't like either of them. I don't think anyone liked both of them. There might have been one person in all polling in 2016. But Trump won people who liked neither candidate by 20 percentage points. When we look at the sort of lover-hater chart here in 2016, you see similar numbers of favorable view towards Democrats, only favorable view towards Republicans, not surprisingly who they voted for. You have a few more people who liked both parties, had favorable views of both parties. They actually broke strongly for the Democrats, and the haters who disliked both in 2016 broke evenly this time, who broke strongly for Donald Trump. The last time, the Democrats picked up 20 percentage points among that group. So, I'm popping around here to lots of different things. How'd the polls do in 2018? First of all, if you look at the national polls, it looks like they did pretty well. If you take the Real Clear Politics average or looking at what most of the national polls were doing, except for CNN, which had it at plus 13. Everyone else had it at plus 7 or 8. And the average was 7 and change, and the Democrats are now it's about 6.8, and I expect when California comes in, Democrats will have an advantage of a little bit over 7 percentage points. Nate Silver, who is now at ABC, but does a separate thing, has said that he thought that polls had a really good night, and then he also, he had 3 different models, so we'll sort of choose one. But he looked at the percent correct that he had of calling House races and Senate races, and said, wow, got 95% right. That must mean that he did pretty well, and must mean that the polls did pretty well. I don't think that's a really fair test, because of that 506, 460, 470 are pretty safe. So if you look at the US House, right, 435 seats in the US House, even in a year when there's lots of flux, 350, 360, probably 370 have 99% or 100% probabilities of going one side or the other. So since I was a little grumpy about that, I decided I'd just go look, and you can see, because it's the less pretty chart, which suggests to you that I made it, and just made it now, although I was sort of impressed with myself. It took me like 20 minutes at the coffee shop in Ann Arbor, but I did figure out how to put the little colors on it. Looking at just competitive Senate races. So any Senate race that was a toss-up or a lean Democrat or lean Republican. And here, at first glance, there appears to be a bit of a Democratic bias in the polls. So if you look at Florida, Indiana, and Missouri, whether it's 538, Real Clear Politics, or the daily cost average, they had Democrats winning all of those races. 538 had Joe Donnelly, the Democrat, winning that race by 3.7. The actual result, so a negative number means the Democrat was ahead, positive number is for Republicans, was actually off by 9.6 percentage points in the Indiana race. That's a pretty hefty margin. The Florida race looked like it was going to be more off, but still off by a couple of percentage points. And the Missouri race off by over 7 percentage points. Actually, I haven't counted it up, but I think, we can do it. I think there was the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We have Democrats doing better in 3 of those races and Republicans doing better in all of the rest. And that's consistent with a bias we saw in 2014 Senate races, where Republicans ended up doing better in Senate races on election day than they had in the polls. Different than 2012, when the state level polling had Barack Obama doing less well than he actually did on election day. So that's just a very quick look. The Real Clear is just a simple average of the last 5 or 6 polls in the state. I would still be really wary of most state level polling that you're looking at. There is not a lot of high quality state level polling. I've even, I don't know if I'm gonna get struck down standing here, I'm even willing to move into some non-probability methods as long as they have a little bit blown up here. But there are very few probability-based surveys done at the state level, and still amazing to me, many of them do not weight on education and do not weight on the combination of race and education, which is just malpractice. Sort of been looking at, small ball, lots of little bit things about individual polls and individual races. There's sort of some big picture trends that happened on election night. The increase in the number of women running for House and Senate and winning House and Senate, that's not a little step up, that's a huge step up. The Latino share of the electorate, especially in a midterm, to be 11% is quite striking. I was also just looking at this other number. So first time I did a post-election panel at the University of Michigan was in 1990 when I was a first year graduate student. The non-white percentage of the electorate in 1990 was 9%. Okay? We can quibble about whether it was 24, 25, or 26% in this electorate. That is a massive demographic change. Even though Ken said I got my dissertation many years ago here, many of us, not all of us, were alive in 1990, and to see that change in the electorate over time is pretty amazing. This is just a little exercise, which I actually, I don't tweet, but someone sent this to me, and then I did a screenshot of, I guess Nate Silver tweeted it, where they went to 270 to win and just said what the map would look like for president if you just looked at the generic House vote. Now, that makes things look pretty good for Democrats. I would say a couple things of caution to Democrats looking at that. One which is interesting, and again, you think back to 1990 when I was a first-year graduate student, Missouri was a swing state, right? West Virginia was a solid Democratic state. An Ohio or an Iowa, even though Iowa sort of overall went for Dems in the House, don't feel very swingy to me anymore. A Democrat could certainly win Ohio, but Ohio is not going to be their 270th electoral vote in the Electoral College. It's going to be more like their 320th or 330th. I know I only have a couple more minutes, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but at the end of the day, and listen, we can barely remember what happened last week, right? The Bob Woodward book was 6 weeks ago, okay? The Caravan was 1 week ago. The synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh was 2 weeks ago. And all of those things, gone from the news cycle. So who knows what we're going to be talking about next week? Who knows what we're going to talk about when I turn my phone around in a half hour. But you can see a plausible path to Donald Trump winning many of those states that he won in 2016, and this election coming down to what Hillary Clinton used to call the blue wall of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which the swing in those states in 2016 won Donald Trump the presidency. I would expect that you see a little bit more of the Democratic nominee in places like Wisconsin or Michigan. So this is just a stark reminder. Yeah, the Democrat won in Wisconsin for governor. He won by 1 percentage point, and he was, and I say this in a nice way, a potted plant, right? He was not a rebel-rousing Democratic progressive. He was a really boring white guy. And a lot of the places where Democrats did well in the House were with, and that's what they should have done, right? Particular members who were relevant or strong for that particular district, many of them, including the Michigan one, saying they would not support Nancy Pelosi. So the strong support that Democrats were able to get by putting good candidates who are a good fit in good races, there's still going to be some work for the Democratic nominee to do, and it's really going to depend on who that Democratic nominee is. But I think Hillary Clinton came to Michigan once in 2016. She went to Wisconsin 0 times, because I got to talk about advertising. This is her advertising buys in Michigan. she spent more money in Texas and Arizona than she did in Michigan in the 2016 election. And because Nick made me, I have to do one slide here on negative advertising, and this comes from the Wesleyan Media Project. So Nick and I have sort of gotten out of this game, but there's still lots of negative advertising. There's even more negative advertising, and you see it growing as both a percentage of the ads that are being aired, and even in this age of digital and Twitter and Facebook and targeted digital advertising, there's going to be, when all is counted up by the television stations, nearly $4 billion spent on television in this past cycle. About $3 billion on local broadcast and close to $1 billion on targeted cable, and a big chunk of that was negative. So I know I popped all over the place, but was glad to be here and share a couple thoughts with you, and look forward to hearing what my friends here have to say, and then happy to answer any questions.
So while I try to get my slides up, I'll say a few things. I'll let you do it then. So on election day, I was contacted by a, call it large partisan organization with a message kind of like, here are two guys, please be on call. And oh my God, must be things happening. Happily, they didn't call back, so this is going to be not about inside stories I have about the dirt on what happened in various places. I was in Florida in 2000, and I just say about that I'm hearing the Republicans especially now replay the tape they made in 2000, the same rhetoric coming out of their mouth, same kind of action, so it's really interesting. And the last thing I'll say in that vein is that Georgia, I think, gives me finally a case of a stolen election. I don't know whether they'll actually win it, but the massive voter suppression by denying people the right to register, that number of people denied registration is vastly more than the margin of victory, and those are predominantly in Democratic areas. So I think that will go in my lecturing, in my election forensics class. That will be a stolen election in the United States. What I want to talk about instead is this project on using Twitter data, which is connected to election forensics. These are my team, these are my co-authors on this, all grad students except Preston Dew, who is a data engineering senior, and Blake, who just finished his PhD and has now got a postdoc at Dartmouth. Where's my clicker? You have the clicker? Thank you. So this is an overview of the points I want to make about this. I don't have any data that is analyzed about 2018 now. We collected a bunch of data that I'll characterize from the same kind of way or similar that we collected in 2016. But I think many of the patterns are going to prove to be identical, because partly they match whatever you would think if you paid any attention to the American political environment these days in terms of polarization and information silos and stuff like that. The point here is that in 2016, I see particular, using Twitter data, which I've just happened to be stumbled into, I guess, same kind of patterns. And so it gives a pretty deep kind of way that people have very different experiences or talk about different experiences in the election. So in fact, people might be experiencing different elections at the same time in the same place based on their, what I'm calling partisan affiliation. So to overview what I have data on is about 2016. And the point there is that in 2016, we have Twitter data, and I'll show you how much and all that in just a second. We have a way of trying to measure what I'm calling ponderously presidential campaign partisan affiliation, and we're fishing for words to describe that. And so if you have suggestions, that's great. I want something that's not literature already, so that's the trick. And they reported different types of incidents, and I'll tell you what an incident is. It's like a long line or that kind of thing. It's an incident. And they tended to be talking to people who were very similar to them in this partisan affiliation measure that we have. And so they're talking to like-minded folks and seeing different things. And so I'm calling this observational biases. I don't think it really has to do with them having real different experiences in the sense of some notion of objectivity, but we can't really prove that because all we have is Twitter data that can describe in Q&A the steps we're trying to get as close to that as we can. So I think it's really something else. And the communication silos is connected to, Fox versus MSC kind of mass media selectivity. Now you can, of course, microscopically tune your audience or your sources to only be the people you think you're going to like. And I think these things will continue in the future and be present in the 2018 data that we have. So here's a definition of election forensics. I invented the term in 2006. This is my definition of it now. We're using statistical methods to determine whether the results of an election accurately reflect the intentions of the electors. There's a lot in that. All I'll say is that usually involves numerical data, vote counts and number of people registered and polling places and things like that. But I think it would be very useful, and I told the NSF this and they said sure, to add to it observations from citizens. And so what we have here is Plan C, to try to get observations from Americans about elections. And Plan C implies there was an A and B that didn't work, so I can talk about that if you want. But Plan C involved using Twitter data. And so in 2016, I was brand new to Twitter. I have a Twitter account now. Last 2 weeks I needed to get access to some data, I guess. But I don't use Twitter myself. But we got from the so-called streaming API about 16 million raw tweets. About 6 million of those turned out not to be retweets, so I call those original tweets. And so we ended up with about 4.5 million of those have unique texts. The trick, and what makes this slower, which is why we wanted to do stuff in real time this time, but it turns out to be, didn't have enough access to the internet to do it. You have to also, the way I do it is we augment actual tweet text with the text at any URL that the tweets contain. And so I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a second. And so we use machine learning approaches. Humans label a bunch of these tweets as either an incident, and I'll show you the definition of what that means, or at least part of the definition. And we have both was it an incident or not, and what type of incident it was. So we labeled either 21,000 or in the second round about 4,000 of these tweets to then feed to a machine learning algorithm to classify these tweets. Here's a bit more about what an incident is. There are 12 different types of incidents, and each type of incident comes with, or most of them come with, an adjective, so to speak. So it's most intuitive here first to talk about line length, and many people looking at different screens, I'm pointing to the line length line. So people might mention the line length, but they might say there's a long line, which I defined following the Presidential Commission a few years ago as 20 minutes or longer. There was a small line or a short line, and they might say there's no line, no waiting, right? Or if you look at polling place event, this is like an election day thing, and this is, I was at the polling place, no comment on how it worked or not, or success voting, and this is the smiling couple with the I voted stickers, this is your canonical example of that, or there were problems voting. I'll just say briefly, I'm not interested in sentiment analysis here, so the idea here is some objective report of it worked or not I'm happy or sad about it. So we also have these other things. We also have registration kind of problems. We have early voting and absentee. Not all of these had enough tweets in our data to be able to do anything with. And so we have basically 4 or 5 different types that are frequent enough in the data that we trust the machine learning algorithm to give reliable results. And we also have enough to be worth talking about. Okay, so here's an example of a tweet. And so the tweet text itself is some subset of what you have here. We followed the URL in it, and this went to Instagram, I believe. And this is the image we found on Instagram, and this is part of the text we found at Instagram. And I won't talk a lot about our classification rules, but the short story is the text itself would not actually be an incident because it's an exhortation to go do stuff. It's not really reporting anything. It says, y'all go vote. But look at the image, tells immediately this is a report of an incident with several facets. It's a successful voting experience. You can see the I voted sticker on the guy here, and tucked behind the woman's jacket, there's an I voted sticker as well. They're smiling, so apparently they had a good experience, successful voting. It's an early voting site. You hit into the date up here, so it's before election day. There's no line that you can see here, so there's no waiting. And so this is a really rich data source. Using the image and the text data, we can get at this. There's a sidebar where our classifiers only use the text, And so there is no one, at least almost no one. There's one person now who may be doing it, but at the time we were doing it, there was absolutely no one on earth who had a classifier that combined text and image data. And so now I have a grad student, Alex Pineda, who's one of my team here, who, despite my wishes, so I kept saying I wanted it, I told him not to do it. So he's about to invent this thing now, so we'll have a classifier that can combine both text and image data. I can talk about that more if you're interested. So many slides here, 125 pages of technical material I'm going to suppress. And so now this is the basic result. I had a Midwest reviewer, panel person complain about we presented there. He said, don't worry. So, okay. So anyway, this is the number of incidents. Overall, there are 315,000 odd incidents. And these are the descriptions of the kind of incident that they are. Anything that's not shown here didn't occur frequently enough for us to carry forward. The not an incident row refers to the fact that we have a two-stage coding procedure. So what looked like an incident on the first round might not look like an incident when we look at it more carefully in the second round with slightly different criteria. And there's about 90,000 of these 300,000 tweets are not really incidents. The most frequently occurring type of incident is, well, voting, either on election day, or if you combine that with the absentee early voting kind of line, it's overall about 110,000 successful voting experiences reported. And that's the most frequent kind of thing. Long lines is fairly often reported, also short lines occasionally, and you see registration problems also show up, and some people are at least complaining about the electoral system or neutral about it. We didn't have enough people happy with the electoral system to carry forward to this stage. Okay, so this is the overall description of what people saw in the election. We can do a lot more with this, and we're doing this, hopefully. So where did it happen? So with a special arduous work, you can do this. You can find the actual location where tweets are. And I won't whine about how hard this is because I'm still in the middle of it, but it's so hard. We have about 12,500 distinct locations. Each dot on this map is a place, a latitude and longitude, where at least one incident occurs. Many incidents occur at the same spot, so this is not the number of incidents. Almost every county, I'd say probably 95%, probably 95% of counties have at least one observation of this type. And I haven't formally counted, but just eyeballing the map here, which has county lines, that's how many it looks like. And it's like the northern border of Montana, it doesn't really have many and so forth. If you break that down to a state summary, you get this kind of a count. California has the most tweets. On a per capita basis, DC has the most tweets. And we're still working on 24,894 of these we need to resolve. About 20,000 come from foreign countries, and it goes on like that. This is not the main point of this talk, so I just want to tell you how the data are really rich. Of course, it's self-generated data, so we have no idea how representative in a random sampling sense the people who do this are, and I've learned to stop worrying about that. In terms of timing, the modal day of an incident is election day. It's the big spike you can see. The left spike are the tweets that we have very reliable information from Twitter, set automatically by Twitter about the place where the tweet was sent from. The graph on the right is all of the tweets, and they seem to be pretty much the same, so there doesn't see that particular detection of any kind of bias in these reports. While the modal day is election day, most tweets were sent early that were incidents like this. So that's the background, and it looks all great. We could talk about where things happened and correlate them with election laws and things like that, presence of absentee, all mail voting and things like that. But our interest is really, do different types of people say different kinds of things? Does everyone have an equal likelihood of reporting a long line? Of saying, I'm a happy voter with my I voted sticker. Turns out I mentioned both of those because the answer is no in that case. And we think it's really different based on what I'll call partisan affiliation. And so how do we get to partisan affiliation? And Ken warned me not to use big words and talk technical, but you can tell me whether I fail at that in the next few slides. Okay. So we have 215,000 distinct users who posted these 315,000 tweets. And just as an aside, we've discovered that about 100,000 of these users also have tweets in our larger set that's not yet classified in 2018. So there's persistence in the presence of people passing keywords at least without knowing whether they're actually tweeting about incidents. And each of these users, about 195,000 of them, had descriptions of themselves. If anyone has, you know how many people have our Twitter account here? Just show of hands. So you guys know what I'm talking about. The rest of you, trust me, they're descriptions. And so I don't have one myself. I have a Twitter account. Mine is blank. I just got one to kind of deal with Twitter as a company. And so we got the descriptions, and we got up to 10,000 of the so-called friends and followers. Donald Trump has like 16.5 million. We didn't try to get anything like that, so we capped it at 10,000. And we got a whole bunch of other information as well. So we got the timelines for these 197,000 users. This is up to about 3,100 tweets for each user. And something called favorites is another few thousand of these. We had a bunch of other stuff down here I can talk about in Q&A, and especially we tried to detect and flag at least bots. And I can talk about how we did that, or tried to. The key step here and attempt to measure partisan affiliation, and we talked about this as a team for a year and a half, Patrick? How much was it? It was a very long time. And then Patrick, who's sitting in the audience here, had the insight that we should use something called word embeddings to describe people's partisanship. The two-step process is, first I was using like actual keywords, like did the person's description say Democrat? Did it say Trump, but not never Trump maybe? Did it say Hillary? So using those actual words seems like it's just Twitter data, so this is what we have to use, a marker for the person's partisan word usage at least. Doesn't mean if they say Democrat, they're like Democrats, but you know, any old port in a storm. The word embeddings idea intuitively is that we can find the words that tend to be used with Democrat or with Republican. And so someone might use every word except Republican, like another user who also says Republican, in which case the hypothesis is the first user is probably pretty similar to the first user. Because their description looks like, you know, guns, fishing, Donald Trump, whatever, and Republican could be there or not, or MAGA could be there or not. So we are using this way to generalize beyond those who use particular words to people who use words in a similar fashion. So we focused on 10 actual keywords, Trump, Clinton, Donald, Hillary, real Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, which are their Twitter handles, MAGA and Stronger Together, which are roughly speaking their campaign slogans, Democrat and Republican. And the next step is that we tell whether the word vector that the word embeddings algorithm can produce, which is a vector of numbers for each word, are these words similar to the user's descriptions or not, right? So someone who's very similar in what they say to the word Democrat is, we're going to call them, in the sense of affiliation, a Democrat, and so on. And so we've done a lot to try to validate this as a measure of partisan affiliation. We use timelines, and we use the retweeting behavior, whether they retweet partisan retweets, so you can find the Twitter accounts that members of Congress of either party, 90% or more of them retweet, and so forth. So to show that particular measure in a very summary fashion, here are the liberal Democrat retweet targets, and you can see that the Republican Trump words all have negative signs. This is a zero-inflated regression model. We'll ignore the zero-inflated part. So all the Republican words, Democratic words, have positive signs. The Trump Republican words have negative signs in terms of their propensity to retweet these liberal Democratic targets. And we did the same thing for the conservative Republican words, and we did other things too to try to validate that these word embeddings measures actually are meaningful for Twitter behavior, presuming that's meaningful. Another thing we did, in an offhand remark by David Laser at APSA a few years ago when we presented an early version of this, suggested that we should use something called triads. And so network people care about triads. And so we got 21 billion so on user friend triads out of our friends data, and another 3 billion out of our follower data, and all together managed to find the so-called closed triads. For example, if A follows B and B follows C and C follows A again, that's a closed directed triad, and the network science literature apparently says that this means they're closer to real, like, meat space buddies than just Twitter friends. So we are using this measure. And what we do with this, and this is the first major result of the paper, the way I'm thinking about it right now that this is leading to, we use the closed triads to try to assess what it means to be similar in terms of our partisan affiliation words. And so the only point I want to make here is that the closed triads, these numbers here are kind of covariances between the different people in the closed triad and then averaged across all the different people. And you see they're like 10 to the minus 3 times a constant or something like that. That's much bigger. These are confidence intervals, lower and upper bounds, in case you're wondering what low and up mean here. Take just a random triples of folks, and it's 5 orders of magnitude smaller with possible negative signs. Compare that to people who are pairs, where an incident tweet is a reply to another tweet. So this person sent a tweet, and then someone tweeted an incident. Hey Joe, how's it going? The reply is, I'm standing in a long line, wait to vote. So that's a reply to kind of pair. And we find that the similarity between those pairs, when both are kind of above average in these word embedding sense, is of the same order of magnitude as the similarity for the closed triads. And so this, and I'm out of time here, so I'll just say, this we take as a marker that the communications are restricted. It's not at random or not generally people are talking to folks. They're talking to folks who are partisanly like them. Okay. So that's the first result. The question is, why does that matter? And the answer is, and I'll have a slide like this and I'll point to one other one and then I'll jump to the end. Because different people with different partisan affiliations report different types of incidents. So bottom line here is we have a regression of a multinomial regression. We take these same kind of pairs of words and we're trying out different versions of how to express this idea. This may not be the final version we do. We have both Trump and Clinton and Donald and Hillary and real Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and so forth. And we're seeing whether they tend to report in this particular slide line length, right? And so the difference between the signs here between Trump and Clinton mean that Trump affiliates, I'll use that phrase here, are less likely to report about line length than Clinton folks are. And so on for all the other kinds of categories and pairs here. We have a p-value chart down here, so if anybody's the p-value police, which apparently is a popular thing to be these days, we're recognizing the fact that I have 63 different tests like this, and so I'm doing a Bonferroni correction for multiple testing, and then we're having the 0.005 critical value that apparently is popular since last April. And so in this case, so the number we need to be significant according to all these hoops we're jumping through is this 10 to the minus 5 number. And long story short, there are a bunch of numbers you can see are smaller than 10 to the minus 5. So I'll just jump to my summary slide here, not that chart, this one right here with some words on it. So if you look across all those different comparisons, across all the different, like 5 different pairs of partisan, Trump, Hillary, whatever you want to describe these affiliation notions at, you find that I'll call them Republican tweeters are different from call them Democrat tweeters or Democratic tweeters. Democrat's the actual word we have here. They're less likely to report an unspecified line length incident or to report a long line. Republicans are less likely. And by less likely, I mean significantly less likely. And that's really, I'm going to use that and live with it here. They're less likely to report an unspecified polling place incident, like I'm just here at the polls, or a neutral polling place incident, but also less likely to report a successful voting experience. And that's really odd to me. They're less likely to report unspecified registration incidents, but more likely to report problems registering. And my joke there is about meth addicts trying to register, but that's just a joke. I have no data to support that. And less likely to report unspecified electoral system or neutral things, so they're kind of maybe more hostile. So we have the result that people are speaking to people like them with partisan separation, and they're seeing different things when they talk back. We weren't unable to recover who looks at the tweets that report these incidents. We tried, we couldn't do it. So it seems like we're calling communication silos with biased reporting of personal experiences in those silos. So it's like that smiling couple. These are not, I saw a newspaper story that said this because we threw those out. These are people reporting what they say are their personal experiences. And so this is a testimony that they're hearing from your Twitter friend saying, this thing happened, and they're saying there are different things happen to them. So this brings down to the personal level the big divergence that I read about getting from the mass media like Fox News or MSNBC or whatever your favorite partisan attributed source is. So this is really embedded deeply, at least in these 200,000 Twitter users, this divide. People aren't even seeing the same world when it comes to what the election is about and what's happening in it. So I don't know whether these reflect really different experiences. I don't think so, but we're working to try to, as much as we can, rule that out using geography. And I definitely think that this is going to be present in our 2018 data and going forward to 2020, unless, of course, the whole complex of the rhetoric about the campaigns change. But the president, I don't know if he's done it in the last hour, but I saw tweeted yesterday about the election being fraudulent and all that. So I don't expect that source of this kind of polarization is going to go away anytime soon. Thanks.
Yes. Got it. Good afternoon, everyone. As you can see by the title of my slides here, I'm going to be speaking about the ways in which what transpired last week was in keeping with what we've seen before and the way in which things have changed. And actually, I think both of those unfolded. A lot of what happened, and I've been pouring through some of the exit poll data, mostly because that's the only data I have access to at this point. And in doing so, it's become clear to me that a lot that we might have expected to change has not. And some areas where we might have or might not have expected change, but depending on your point of view, we do see some differences. So that's going to be the theme of my comments here over the next 15 minutes or so, the way in which some things have emerged that that really we might have expected change and there wasn't, and in some cases there were. Okay, so obviously we're here to talk about the election and what it meant and how to make sense of it. But before I do that, I wanted to start with this figure here from Pew. It's from 2017. You may or may not be able to see all the numbers and all that's going on here, but the basic takeaway is that over the last 20 some odd years, the country has become more, Ken made comments to this effect a few moments ago. The country has become more ethnically and racially diverse, and this is being reflected in one of the two major parties, but not so much in the other. That is to say, the Democrats are becoming increasingly racially diverse, such that whites still represent a majority, but not an overwhelming one as they did as recently as 20 years ago. And Republicans have changed somewhat, but not very much. They remain an overwhelmingly and disproportionately white electorate, or white party. That's relevant because it's going to explain much of what I'll be showing you in the remainder of my slides. That's part of why we've got the continuity, because the parties have been changing, but the Democrats have always been a kind of a more racially diverse party, and they're even more so now, and the Republicans remain a racially homogenous party. All right, so this may not be surprising to anyone. This just breaks down by the major racial groups how they voted in 2018, the national House vote, and comparing this to 2014. And so what do we make of this? What point do I want to draw you to here? Well, there is some change here. I think maybe perhaps especially with respect to Asian Americans. I don't know what to make of that very big jump between 2014 and 2018, although we're talking about roughly 3% of the electorate. The exit poll data, which is going to be the bases of any of my comments this afternoon, are not perfect in every way, and they're especially not perfect when it comes to measuring smaller populations like racial and ethnic minorities. So this could be noise. I suspect that Asian Americans are moving in towards the Democratic Party over time, probably not to this great a degree. But aside from that particular standout finding, the relative continuity across the years is one thing that strikes me when I look at this data, looking at the different racial and ethnic groups, this current midterm versus the most recent midterm. It's true that 2018 was a good year for Democrats, and as a consequence, all of these groups are moving towards the Democratic Party. to the extent that they have room to move. African Americans not so much because ceiling effect. But just to put this in context, and I'll mostly be drilling down into the numbers for whites in my remaining moments here. The 44% of whites nationally who voted for the Democratic ticket, that's relatively good. That's on the high end of average for them, going back over the last 25, 30, 35 years. To put that in perspective, Hillary Clinton, according to the exit polls, got, I believe, 37% of the white vote in 2016. Barack Obama received, I believe, 41 or 39% of the white vote in 2012, and I think he got like 43% in 2008. 2008 was a very good year for Democrats, mostly because it was a very bad year for Republicans because of the economy. Even in that year, Democrats only managed to get 43% of the white vote at the presidential level. So yes, there's change. Yes, we have evidence that 2018 was a good year for Democrats, but it's amazing in some respects how little has changed in spite of the fact that it was a good year for them. All right, so some of you may have already seen this figure. This simply, I wanted to provide this figure to kind of drive home the implications of the racially and ethnically divided electorate that we have. It is translating in many respects into the most diverse, at least with respect to race and ethnicity, the most diverse Congress we've ever had. This is also true with respect to gender, which I'll make a comment about in a moment. So that's noteworthy, that's historic, that's different, that's change, as it were. But it's interesting to see that we're not just getting a more diverse Congress, we're seeing that one party in particular is becoming diverse, and the other party is remarkably lacking in diversity. So that may have implications in all manner of different ways, but I just wanted to draw your attention to it. It's connected to the composition of voting preferences in 2018, and that's connected to the composition of the partisan preferences that have been present over the last several decades. Gender. We've heard a lot of talk about the ways in which, in many respects, 2018 was the year of the woman, very similar in some respects to what we had in 1992, following the other controversial Supreme Court nomination, Supreme Court and Clarence Thomas in that case, and Brett Kavanaugh in the more recent case. So you may not be able to read all the numbers there, but you can definitely see the trend, and the trend is that women are growing in dramatic size in their fraction of the United States Congress. So that's noteworthy. It's still very far from parity, but it is completely different from what it was in the not too distant past. But again, this is happening more in one party than it is in the other by a pretty healthy margin. So that's interesting. And the comparable figure that I just showed you in terms of the composition of the Congress with respect to race and ethnicity is a reflection in some respects to the divided nature of the voting population as well. But the gender result that I'm just now here showing you is actually not very much a reflection of the gender vote, in the sense that men and women don't vote anywhere near as distinctly and differently as is the case for racial and ethnic minorities relative to whites. And here's evidence to that effect. This is all just taken from the exit polls, again comparing 2014 to 2018. There is a gender gap in 2018, if by here defining gender gap as the difference, we're just looking at Democratic House support for men relative to women, looking at whites here only. But it doesn't get any bigger, really, in 2014 relative to 2018. And that may be surprising to many people. It was in some ways surprising to me. I expected the gap in this respect to get larger for all the reasons we might expect, right? Because of the Kavanaugh hearings, because of the number of women running for office, because of the colorful language used by our commander-in-chief. All these things might have led to, you might have expected, a growing gender gap, but actually that's not the case. I wasn't even convinced that that was true, so I thought, let me drill down a little further, and I looked at how gender plays out with respect to marital status. This is looking at the entire population because they don't have it broken down by race. And the reason I'm looking at marital status is that it's a well-known finding that married women are more likely to vote Republican than are unmarried women. So I thought maybe that's where the gender finding is going to be located. But you can see there that the numbers don't really suggest that. Again, there is movement in the direction from 2014 to 2018. There is definitely movement towards the Democratic Party, but there's no more indication, at least to my eye, that that's concentrated among married women relative to married men. They, in both cases, are moving at more or less the same rate, at least in 2014 relative to 2018. So a lot of lack of change there. Here's where you actually get some change. And this is one of the first things that jumped off the page when I started drilling down into the exit poll data. And I'm referring here in particular to voters, white voters here under 30. The extent to which they have moved towards the Democratic Party was quite big, bigger than you might have expected. It is a rare thing for basically any demographic of whites to be voting in the majority for the Democratic candidate. So the fact that that number 56 may not seem very consequential to you, but I look back, is going as far back with exit poll data to 1982, and it's never been exceeded. That is to say, from now, the 2018 election going back to 1982, at no point do whites under 30 vote at a higher rate than 56% for the Democratic candidate than they did in 2018. So something may be afoot here, at least with respect to generation. Again, all the age groups are moving towards the Democrats, but the biggest jump, far and away, is for younger whites. Is that a trend? Is that a blip? I don't know. But I wanted to draw your attention to that. The other noteworthy finding here, really the two big key changes that I see in the exit poll data, has to do with education. So whites who are not graduates, who have not graduated from college, their preferences with respect to House candidates and their partisan preferences in 2018 relative to 2014 are roughly comparable. There's a little bit of movement, but it's not anything to write home about. The big change is really among those who have graduated from college. Again, most demographics of whites tend to be in the column, at least narrowly, of the Republican Party. Here, we're finding a big shift in over just the, this is not obviously just about, well, it may be in part about Trump, but we're not only talking about Trump. Something's going on here. So I really wanted to examine the movement among college and non-college age whites on the dimension of gender. But they didn't actually have that information for 2014, so I couldn't do that. But just drilling down into 2018, we can see that this just basically is showing you how this works for men and for women. Now, there's an intercept difference, obviously, here for men versus women. White men are starting out at lower levels of support for the Democratic Party, but the movement between 2014 and 2018, is roughly comparable for both groups, men and women. The moral of the story here, again, is that this seems to be more about education, it seems to me, than it is about gender. So all the rhetoric notwithstanding and all the divisiveness surrounding the Kavanaugh confirmation, really generation and education appear to be the things that are most consequential with respect to movement in the recent past relative to this most recent midterm. A couple more points and then we'll end and we can do Q&A. So I started out with things that haven't changed, and then I started to talk about things that have changed, and now I want to end on some things again that haven't changed very much. So in terms of born-again evangelicals, whites here, there's not much movement. This is not a population that is enamored of the Democratic Party. That was true in 2014. That's also true in 2018. Those who are not in that camp, I should say that evangelicals represent roughly, white evangelicals, I think, about 25% of the electorate. So it's not a trivial part. It's not overwhelming, but it's not trivial either. They are more or less static over time. There is movement among those who are not in that camp. That's probably especially true for those who are non-religious. So there is some movement going on there. And then the final slide, I'll end where I started, which is on the issue of race again. I'm going to focus, just walk you through very briefly some of the stark racial divides, really, that played out in the Senate campaign in Mississippi, the gubernatorial contest in Georgia and Florida, and the Senate campaign in Tennessee. Now, I have Mississippi up here. There are actually 2 Senate contests in Mississippi, as you may know. This is not the special election. This is the other contest. But if I had the special election up here, it looked basically the same. That's obviously very massive. That's a massive racial divide that unfolded last week in the state of Mississippi, but also in the gubernatorial contest in Georgia. It was striking, the extent to which race influenced the outcome in that contest as well. Maybe not striking, depending on one's view of history. But even in so-called upper South states like Tennessee and Florida, we also see slightly less stark divisions, but stark nonetheless. So the takeaway, it seems to me, is that the racial and ethnic component of the partisan division in this country is alive and well and has played out in 2018 in ways very similar to what we've seen before. In some states in the South, it's especially remarkably exacerbated. And I just want to end by saying that, again, it seems to me that to the extent that we're seeing any emerging changes in the partisan coalitions, I would look to perhaps generation and education as the source, and not so much with respect to gender, which isn't changing, nor for that matter is race. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand and Catherine will bring a microphone to you. The floor is open. It's got to be a question.
So on the generational difference, I'm wondering whether you or others have looked at other kinds of differences by age in recent election study data that have to do with political predispositions, partisanship, attitudes towards race, attitudes towards gender, whether there's some reason to think that the differences you showed there, the quick movement between 2014 and 2018 by age, is something that's likely to be more permanent than we can tell from that figure alone.
So that's, hopefully everyone can hear me. That's a good question. I've done some work in the past on generational differences among whites and actually haven't found much of it. So I didn't go in with the expectation that there would be big generational differences of the sort that I found. I think it's noteworthy. That's partly why I wanted to emphasize it. It's hard to know how durable these things are going to be, of course, so I would just be speculating. But when I went back and looked to see, well, maybe this was just a blip, we've seen this before, but the exit poll data going back to the 80s just doesn't show it. So I think there may be something new that's happening here.
Shy group.
Wait for the mic, please. You have this.
Oh, so the question, if you didn't hear, is about the racial differences that may have broken down on some upper Midwest states. Well, I looked at some of this in anticipation of that question, but it looks like Ken is ready, more prepared than I am. The short answer is the racial divide is not as stark, only because it can't get much more stark than Mississippi and Georgia, but it's still present. It was present even here in Michigan. So most whites did not vote for Whitmer, for governor, for example, or for Stabenow. I think narrowly the Republican candidate, somewhere in the neighborhood of 55%, voted for, the white population voted for those candidates. But blacks voted at rates of 85 to 90% for the Democratic candidates in the upper Midwest, on the Northeast, and on the West Coast. So that part is not terribly different.
So I did write it down, but I didn't bring my reading glasses. But I think I can still make it out. So I think what Vince did is really interesting and looking at it in the correct way. And what I did was I broke it down between, and I think I mentioned before when I was making a snarky comment about the polling, that people who are not weighting to the combination of education and race, that's the way you get these states really wrong because of those big differences that Vince is showing. Just imagine, given those differences that he showed, if you don't get the number of non-college educated whites right, that's gonna create a lot of trouble. But in Michigan, so the difference in voting between college educated non-whites and non-college educated non-whites, there is no real difference. They go massively for the Democrats. So in Michigan, it was a 58 percentage point margin for Whitmer among non-whites. Among whites without a BA, Schuette won them by 12 percentage points, and among whites with a BA, Whitmer actually won by 6 percentage points. But you compare that to in Ohio, and it's one of the reasons why Michigan is still swingy and probably even Democratic, and Ohio seems to be going the other way, that the margin among non-college educated whites was 22 percentage points rather than the 12 percentage points in Michigan. So non-college educated whites were 10 percentage points more Republican than they were in Michigan, and college educated whites in Ohio went for the Republican, barely, by 2 percentage points, but that's also an 8 percentage point swing in Ohio. And I think if you look at the demographics of Ohio and Michigan, they're pretty similar. There might be a couple percentage points more non-whites in Michigan, but they're very similar states in terms of demographics and demographics of the vote, and the difference is in the behavior then of those college-educated whites and non-college-educated whites. I was also so glad you did that because that was the chart I left on the cutting room floor, and so this is really important stuff.
I'm kind of curious about, like, in the 2018 midterms, like, were there stark differences between voter turnout for different ethnic groups?
Yeah, so, in some ways, I think it's the undercovered story of this election that we had, obviously varies by state, but close to 50% of the voting eligible population voted in a midterm election, which is a full 10 percentage points more than it was in the last election. And if you look at the demographics of, for instance, the Michigan electorate, for the Michigan electorate to be more non-white in a midterm election than it was in a presidential election is quite striking. You compare non-white turnout in Ohio in 2016. Clinton lost it, but she campaigned there, and she didn't lose it because black turnout was down. You look at Clinton got 75,000 fewer votes in Wayne County than Barack Obama did, and Democrats were able to narrow that gap in differential turnout, which is quite an accomplishment in a non-presidential year.
So in states where you saw Senate races and governor's races that are statewide ballots, where you had governors go towards one party and senators go towards another party, do you have a good idea who the voters are who are voting split ticket in statewide races, or is there not enough data to prove who they are yet? I know this happened in Michigan, for example. Stabenow polled less than Whitmer did, as well as in Texas. Beto outperformed Lupe Valdez.
Yeah, I'm going to do the great professor answer, which is that is an awesome question. And some graduate students should study that. But I think you look in Wisconsin, where Tammy Baldwin did 10 percentage points better than Scott Walker. In Ohio, the Republican DeWine won while Sherrod Brown was winning. DeWine did 10 percentage points better than Sherrod Brown. Here, which is one of our big surprises on election night when we were calling races, that we were able to call the governor's race before we were able to call the Senate race here. And, you know, it was a very solid win. One thing you can do if it would interest you. So, not only because he's a Michigan PhD, but it actually makes sense to mention him. Charles Franklin does a massive amount of polling at Marquette, high quality polling, and you don't have enough in a single poll to look at people who are splitting their ticket, but you can aggregate. You could probably get 10,000 cases looking at his polling over the last 3 months, and so you would have enough cases to look at people who were for Baldwin and also for Walker. And coming back to 2020, that's really interesting, right? So there's a lot of non-college educated whites who supported Trump, who supported Scott Walker, who voted for the lesbian woman from Madison, Wisconsin.
Yes, some people feel that our current president supported hate groups. And I haven't heard any statistics on whether they make up a significant amount of the voting population and if it had any impact on the numbers.
Are you talking about hate groups?
Yes.
Well, it depends on how you define a hate group. If
Speak the truth.
If you mean card-carrying white nationalists or hooded Klansmen, then it's a very small fraction, extremely small fraction of the population. If you mean individuals who are very sympathetic to rhetoric which might be interpreted as encouraging, white nationalist sentiment, that's actually a pretty big fraction of the electorate. We're talking about, in terms of the population, the parts of the electorate that is sympathetic to, say, Confederate sympathizing rhetoric. That's not fringe. That's actually mainstream. But if we're talking about hooded Klansmen or card-carrying Nazis, that's pretty rare. So I'm not sure how satisfying that is for you, but it depends on the variety of hate group that you're referring to.
We were discussing up here before whether the Bradley effect is still a thing, which maybe people are too young to know what the Bradley effect was. He was the African-American mayor of Los Angeles who ran for governor of California, was ahead in all the polls, and then did not win. I think it was interesting. Obama actually overperformed his poll numbers, and certainly overperformed his poll numbers in 2012. That was probably because pollsters had too many whites in the electorate. But we've now seen 2014, 2016, and 2018 that Democrats are underperforming in the polls. And I think some of what we saw in Florida, where was Gillum behind in any public poll that you saw?
No.
And I just looked at the Senate races, but I think he was 3, 4, 5 percentage points in the polling.
So much so that I thought Gillum was going to win. And I'm not usually optimistic about these sorts of things, as some in the room might know. But I thought Gillum was going to win that contest, and I was surprised that he didn't, because as Ken just indicated, every public poll I saw had him ahead by a narrow margin, but still consistent.
And so it's not answering your hate group question, but clearly there's something going on there, and the fact that it was more pronounced in a race where one of the candidates was an African American is a little bit of a tell to me.
Hi, my question is for the panel. So in the recent address given by President Trump, he kind of had a little bit of a rant in which he talked about how there are candidates across across the country who didn't kind of embrace him and embrace his rhetoric, and those are the ones that continue to lose, and that's what you would continue to see happening. How much does the data support this as fact or fiction across the nation?
So, not looked at it systematically, again, the Professor Dodge. My sense is, used a big scary endogeneity word, where Trump went and campaigned for Senate candidates is where he thought it would work, right? So, going to North Dakota, going to Missouri, going to Indiana, going to Tennessee, not by accident that he went there, not by accident that those people embraced Trump and that they won. I think the members who did not embrace Donald Trump were precisely in those suburban districts where those college-educated whites, and especially college-educated white women, broke heavily the other way. And you saw Republicans wiped out in many of those districts. So, still counting the votes, but I think there was 25 districts that Clinton won in 2016 that Republican was the member of Congress. Almost all of those were suburban districts, and I think Republicans lost 18 out of there.
My answer is there's no truth whatsoever to what Donald Trump says. I could stop there, but it's hard to know how to quantify such a question. The kind of selection bias that Ken was just talking about of going to places, and the definition of what support Trump means, of course, depends on whatever you want to say. But I'll note that, of course, the candidates who didn't support Trump, many of them disappeared from the Congress, from what the House say, by retiring, by being beaten in the primary. And so hard to know what to do with those candidates. And if you look at the surprising wins, there were a couple of real, I'd call them Trump supporters, Dana Rohrabacher, for example, in that district, and was it Oklahoma that was really, really red, a big surprise. Kansas, was it? Someplace. And also the South Carolina district. And so a lot of hard to define them as not Trump supporters lost pretty strongly. So I pretty much think it's unrelated to anything Trump says about the facts of supporting him or not. My theory of the election is that it's not even, well, some voters are diverse. So some voters are just, impeach Trump, or IMTA. What's the acronym on my T-shirt? Anyway, IMTA, I think. I left out the F. And other voters are just doing the usual midterm policy thing. They are for health care. And the Democrats managed to define that as the issue. And usual in American elections, going back in my data, the early 70s, survey data, or earlier and other kind of studies, people like that policy. They think the Republicans are on the wrong side of that policy, with great objective evidence of that. Was it 70 votes to repeal health care, active efforts to eliminate the mandate, cut back on pre-existing conditions? So a lot of it was just a straightforward policy vote on that. And that's irrelevant to supporting Trump or not. It's just Trump happens to have particular positions today, maybe. It's hard to say what Trump's views are on policy. So that's my answer.
Let me say one more thing. You can go, move beyond the question. The day before the election, we usually get briefed by both parties, Senate committees, House committees, and a bunch of other folks. And I put it up here, but then I failed to talk about. Republicans were talking about how they were massively outspent in many of these districts. And we can have a discussion of whether what's leading what there and what the impact of money is. But the amount of money the Democrats were able to outspend Republicans in these swing districts is 2, 3, 4 to 1. And the person, one of the Republican people kept saying, well, we just don't think Trump's a factor in these races. And we kept trying to get him to say, well, why do you think people are giving $50 million to that person in whatever small district that they've never heard of? And he wouldn't say it, but that's the other effect that Trump is having, is the amount of money, and not only energy on the Democratic side, but amount of money on the Democratic side. And there's also some strategery there. $100 million, which everyone gave to Beto. Certainly his candidacy took some Democrats over the goal line in some of those House races. It also made Republican outside groups and Republican money spend money in Texas, and dollars they were spending in Texas they were not spending in other races as well.
I'll jump in one more time on that. But a lot of that's also endogenous, because you also before that had very strong candidates chosen to fit the district, partly by party actions, endorsing rather than staying out of primaries, for example. And literature on that says when everybody anticipates it's going to be a big year for the other party, that party gets stronger candidates. So it's hard to say what came first in that. Once the minority candidate won the presidential election and decided to have policies that were not toward the middle, then you could see this coming a mile away.
Well, even chipping again on that. So yeah, absolutely, totally familiar with that lecture, with that research about endogeny when it comes to money. But in some ways, we've never had the case before where there was the magnitude of advantage that Democrats had and the magnitude that Democrats had in open races, and for challengers to have more money than incumbents. And where the literature is a little bit more mixed is it's certainly when incumbents spend less, it's often they spend less because they're not in trouble. That was not the case in many of these races, right? They were spending more than they ever had. They were just getting swamped.
So a brief comment and then a question. So to the point about the polling miss in Florida's governor's race, another point to corroborate that, it's not just that Andrew Gillum consistently ran ahead in several of the polls leading up, but that he was also running ahead of the Democratic nominee for Senate, Bill Nelson. And of course, as we see in the results right now, Nelson is running, however slightly ahead, but ahead of Gillum. So just wanted to put that out there. My question is for the panel, and it's about the Proposal 3 that passed here in Michigan. And I wanted to get your sense of how you think it will affect the upcoming presidential election. Do you think that, that perhaps the reduced hurdles and obstacles to voting would be sufficient to swing the state by itself, or what other factors do you think might be at play?
It's hard to say literature on whether the availability of absentee or early voting increases turnout. I believe is mixed at best. My intuition, it shows it doesn't make any difference. It just makes it easier for those who are going to vote anyway to vote. Clearly other factors like the things that caused the gigantic swings and everything and increase in turnout this time was not caused by an increase in access to early voting and so forth. So I think it's unknown. The bigger factor will be whether that change leads parties to campaign differently to direct those voters for the, I use the word persuadable, or the GOTV efforts to that marginal voter. I don't think that's going to make a big difference. What will make a big difference is the presence of a Democratic governor, of course, and then down the road, the other proposition, is it 2 or is that the pot one? I can't remember. The anti-gerrymandering thing will make a huge difference in the state legislative case. Michigan's one of the worst states in the country in that regard. And that happened in several states. But I don't think early voting or absentee or no excuse absentee is going to make a huge difference.
I'll be very brief here. I think I agree completely with what Walter just said. It's that doesn't mean that it isn't worth supporting those initiatives, certainly. But in terms of their ability to have massive effects on outcomes, my understanding of literature is very much similar to what Walter just indicated. It's pretty mild.
What extent, though, on this point, are the lack of attention to the rural population whose interest is not served by the Republicans at all at the present time? In several states, I mean, North Dakota, Minnesota, and so on, Montana, even though Tester won in Montana, it was just barely. And it seems to me that the Democrats currently are focusing primarily on urban populations and saying that the kind of the rural populations are not, we don't have to pay attention to them because it's a small number, but it seems to me it's fairly significant in certain states.
I think that's the question going forward in 2020, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the Democratic primary for president, for instance, plays out. So I think we've all made the point about how, Walter just made it, about how Democrats are able to recruit high-quality candidates tailored to their districts. And unlike the Clinton campaign in 2016, they actually talked to non-college educated whites, and while they didn't win them, they did better with them than the last time. So I think it's a debate which national Democrats are having, and it's not, I think, like they can pull the levers and decide what's going to happen, but they are deciding whether they want to be a party of non-whites in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right? Quite frankly, or clearly the demographic factors in this country is the country is becoming less white, more non-white. We're also seeing certain states tip because of that. But I think it's a big decision for the Democratic Party whether they're going to talk to these non-college educated whites. And looking at the numbers, I do not think, especially in these Midwestern states, it's a population they can ignore. And there's also some evidence that, again, Tammy Baldwin spoke to those folks.
Yeah, also Joe Manchin, of course. So, and there are many congressional candidates whom I don't know by name who were targeting. Was it Connor Lamb was another one who was doing that? So I don't think the party itself has any opposition to that. I hate to say to their big tent party. But of course, you put your finger on what's going to be the answer to the huge crisis question that's built into the system of having the Electoral College. If the population continues to, smart, educated, move to a coast or a city and leave the big empty rural areas to those who couldn't get out, and if the predilections continue like they kind of are, and I don't quite understand how that happens given everything, but it's the way it is now, then we face a series of minority presidents in the future because you don't have to get anywhere near a majority of the vote to get a majority of the Electoral College. And so I think structurally this has to be solved somehow.
He went to all 250 counties, and he made a point of the fact that he went to all 250 counties, even though Houston was the county that gave him the biggest proportion.
Okay, Rosemary.
But it's like, can a Joe Manchin or Connor Lamb, who are pro-gun and pro-life, get through the Democratic primaries in very many places? And the answer is probably no. Now, they were very good fits for their areas, but...
Okay, one more question. Try to make it brief. Okay?
I'll be quick. So I saw a poll maybe a few weeks ago that basically said that the majority of historically Republican voters now associate more closely with Trump than the actual Republican Party. And so I'm wondering, I guess this is more long term than we've been discussing, but after Trump, will these trends that or maybe not trends, but just data points that you've identified, will they endure, or are they like a seed that's been planted that will kind of affect our generation and future generations? Or after Trump is gone and maybe the GOP becomes a bit more, just loyal to the party and rather a person, will these trends probably change?
I'll be very quick. That's a fair question. I mean, I don't know is the real short answer, but I guess the somewhat more professorial answer is that I think when the decision that first-time voters, young people make in the first few election cycles has implications for their preferences moving forward. So, if, as seems at least plausible, that the entering young generation, because of the current political environment, is embracing a democratic identity, I don't want to push that too far because the evidence for it is a little shaky, but there is at least some evidence for it. If that is true, then that's going to have implications for Republicans moving forward long after Trump is off the scene, and that's not great for Republicans.
Even in 2020, but certainly further down, it's unclear how many parties there will be that are competitive and what they're called.
I mean, like, I think it's a great question, and I would really pay attention to what happens in the Democratic primaries in 2020 and what happens to the Republican Party in 2044, because Trump took over the Republican Party. Trump's approval among Republicans is 90+%, right? And it was a hostile takeover of a party.
All right, thanks to our panelists. This was great. Thanks to